YouTube world. Hello. So, this is going to be a first for this channel. I'm going to be reading the first chapter from my master's thesis. So I did my master's degree in my Master of Arts degree in geography. I started in 2008, finished at the very end of 2010 at UBC, the University of British Columbia in Vancouver. And I was on a full scholarship after acing my bachelor's degree, which I completed in 2008 at Simon Fraser University in Burnaby, which is right next to Vancouver. Okay. So here we go. I should have been more prepared. How am I going to do this now? Okay, just screen. I'll just share my screen with you all. Okay. So my thesis is available online. You can simply do a Google search for the title, which is how I always find it. The Death and Life of the Little Mountain Housing Project. And it comes up, UBC Library Open Collections. And that's me, Thomas Michael Thompson. This is the abstract. Might as well read that. Opened in 1954, Vancouver's Little Mountain Housing Project was the first public housing project in BC and among the oldest in Canada. For more than half a century, Little Mountain provided subsidized rental housing for low and moderate income families and seniors. Throughout its years, Little Mountain was at the forefront of housing policy in BC. Little Mountain's initial development in the 1950s spelled out how the federal-provincial public housing partnership would operate in BC. In the 1970s, Little Mountain was the first public housing project in Canada managed by a committee of tenants. And today, Little Mountain continues to be on the leading edge of provincial housing policy, as it is the first public housing project to be privatized and redeveloped under a new province-wide policy announced in 2007. Redevelopment and privatization have involved the displacement of 194 Little Mountain households and the demolition of all but one of the buildings at Little Mountain. Well, at the time I wrote this, but later on that other building was demolished too. The displacement of the tenants and the near total clearance of the large site are among some of the disturbing similarities between the redevelopment of Little Mountain and the old urban renewal programs of the mid-20th century. But unlike urban renewal, the redevelopment of Little Mountain is connected to neoliberal restructuring and the erosion of the welfare state. When Little Mountain is eventually rebuilt, still not rebuilt, it will feature a mixed-income community that will combine social housing tenants and market homeowners. Redevelopment has been justified in part on the basis that social mixing will create more social capital for the low-income families at Little Mountain. But this thesis shows that Little Mountain was already remarkably rich in social capital. In contrast to the stereotype of the troubled housing project, Little Mountain offered a very supportive, happy, and beautiful living environment. Ironically, displacement has isolated many of the tenants. Through an analysis of the distribution of benefits and losses of redevelopment to various relevant groups, this thesis shows that the Little Mountain tenants are being squeezed out of the benefits of redevelopment while bearing significant losses. Okay, and I always like to look at the usage statistics when I come to this page. So it's showing you like every month how many views and how many downloads it got. I always find it fascinating that people are still, like, this is 14 years old now and people still come here every month to download it. And some months it really spikes up. Like, so in June, this past June, it got 38 views and 21 downloads. I mean, that's a substantial amount of downloads. So yeah, going back further, February 2022, like, what was going on then? It had 232 views and 66 downloads. I have no idea why people got, like, it's probably like some professor assigns it as reading to a class, and so all of a sudden everybody in the class has to download it. There's something like that going on. Or some article gets published that cites it, and then people are checking the citations. And like, look, October 2019 had 39 downloads. Anyways, and then I also like to look at you can see where people are accessing. So the top top country is the US for accessing it, and then Canada, Great Britain, not really surprising. And then it shows you the cities. Like, so the top city in the world for viewing my thesis online is Houston, Texas. I mean, who would have thought? And then Ann Arbor, I guess that's in Michigan, unknown. I don't know where Mountain View is. San Francisco, Wilmington, I don't know where that is. Southend-on-Sea, that's somewhere in Britain. Vancouver is way down the list. So I just always find that fascinating. All right, so let's get into it. So once I've downloaded it, it comes up as a PDF on my screen, and there's the title page. All this had to be formatted exactly according to UBC standards. Preface: the research conducted for this thesis was approved by the UBC Behavioral Research Ethics Board. Yeah. And then this is the table of contents. So there's 8 chapters. So I'm just going to read the first chapter in this live stream, which is actually probably the shortest chapter. List of tables, list of figures. There's a lot of figures. There's a lot of photos. Acknowledgements. Above all, I would like to express my deepest gratitude to the tenants of the Little Mountain Housing Project, especially those who allowed me to interview them. Even while many of the tenants were under enormous stress due to redevelopment and relocation, they allowed me into their homes and shared very personal details of their lives. I will be forever grateful for all of you have taught me. In particular, I could not have done this research without the assistance of Little Mountain tenant Ingrid Steenhuisen. In addition to interviews, Ingrid invited me to meetings where I met other tenants, provided valuable archival documentation on Little Mountain, and was always available when I needed to confirm facts. All the while, Ingrid was fighting for her and her mother's home, and also helping other Little Mountain tenants. Throughout this emotional journey, Ingrid displayed a level of determination, compassion, and intelligence that I am truly in awe of. Ingrid, you will forever inspire me. For sure. I would also like to thank the public figures who are gracious enough to allow me to interview them. I'm also thankful for those who answered questions via email. In addition, I would like to thank the many other fabulous people whom I've had the opportunity to meet and learn from as events have unfolded over the past few years. I would also like to express thanks to all who allowed me to reprint their photographs. Your photographs have helped to preserve the memory of what was a very special place. I am also enormously grateful to all who have helped me in my academic journey. My supervisors, David Lay and Alvin Wiley, have supported me and taught me a great deal. I will forever cherish the knowledge you have passed on to me. I could not have done this without your help. I mean, they were great while I was with them. I mean, especially David Lay. I mean, I don't want to say especially both of them, but I really enjoyed the course that I took from David Lay when I was at UBC, and I mean, he's a rock star in academia. So it was quite an honor to work with him. That being said, both of these people, neither one of them speak to me anymore due to politics, because I was a Trump supporter. So, but I mean, David Lay I don't think he could have had the career that he had, the academic career that he had, if it wasn't for free speech. Like, he used his free speech all during his academic career. But now that he's retired, he's quite content that those who come after him don't have free speech. He's okay with that. So, I mean, he really diminished. I mean, I cherished my time with him and Elvin Wiley. Like, it was a great time in my life, and I did learn a lot from them. It's true. And they did. I mean, if it wasn't for them, I couldn't have done this thesis. That is true. But the fact that I would be dropped over politics like a hot potato, I mean, they've diminished themselves in my eyes. They really have. And Elvin Wiley too. His behavior was especially juvenile. I also must thank those who helped me advance when I was an undergraduate student. I'd like to express deep gratitude to Nicholas Blomley of Simon Fraser University. Just a total dweeb and a bully when it comes to this political disagreement that I mentioned. So he really diminished himself in my eyes. Who encouraged me to research this topic at the graduate level. I'm also indebted to Bill Burgess of Kwantlen Polytechnic University. I don't know. I haven't had any political disagreements with him. I don't know if he would fall in line with the rest of the academics. I hope he wouldn't, but I don't know. Who helped me transfer from Kwantlen to Simon Fraser University. And of course, I must thank the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada for providing me with financial support while undertaking this research. Last but not least, I'd like to thank my friends and family who have encouraged and helped me at many points along the way. My wonderful boyfriend, Bill Barker. Okay, so this is before he was my husband. Now he's my ex-husband. We're divorced. Deserves special credit for providing me with emotional support during what at many times has been a very painful journey. In addition, Bill also helped to preserve the memory of Little Mountain with his beautiful photographs, many of which I've used in this thesis. Thank you all. He did help a lot with taking photographs. That is true. Okay, so here we go. Introduction. It was on the morning of Saturday, May 12th, 2007. I'm just curious, is anybody watching? I should check in too, just make sure. See what's going on over here. Okay, nothing. It was on the morning of Saturday, May 12th, 2007, when I first learned that BC's first public housing community, the Little Mountain Housing Project, was slated for redevelopment. Little Mountain is located at the approximate geographic center of the city of Vancouver, bounded by Main Street, 37th Avenue, Ontario Street, and 33rd Avenue. Although redevelopment had been first announced in the Vancouver Sun on March 21st, 2007, I missed reading that initial article, probably because at the time I had a very heavy course load as an undergraduate student. Following that first newspaper article, most of the early press coverage of the Little Mountain redevelopment was in the neighborhood newspaper, the Vancouver Courier, which I did not get at my home deep in Metro Vancouver's suburbs. Right, so the Vancouver Courier was a free newspaper that was delivered to neighborhoods within the city of Vancouver, but because I lived in a suburb, I did not get that. Thus, by the time I first read about it in the newspaper, relocation of the tenants had already been underway for about a month and a half. Already by this early stage, many Little Mountain tenants were angry because they had not been consulted and they were being pressured to move. In the newspaper article, one Little Mountain tenant said, they're being told if they don't sign now an agreement to move to other BC housing sites, there won't be anything available for them later on. Right? I mean, that was the intimidation. When I read this, I found it deeply concerning because while it had been several years since I had last been at Little Mountain, I have a long-standing connection to the place stemming from when I lived there as a very young child in the early 1980s. My connection to Little Mountain is also through my mother, who grew up in the surrounding neighborhood and has many friends who have lived there throughout the years right up until redevelopment. The May 12, 2007 newspaper article announced that the tenants were holding a protest that day from 11 a.m. to 1 p.m. on Main Street between 36th Avenue and King Edward Avenue. For those who don't know Vancouver, just as an aside, King Edward Avenue, that would be 25th Avenue. Most of the avenues in Vancouver are numbered, but some special avenues get names. So King Edward Avenue would be where 25th Avenue would be. Immediately after reading this article, I quickly got myself ready and ran out the door in order to make it to the protest in time. That was the beginning of what would be my 3.5-year emotional, political, and academic journey, culminating in this thesis. Thus, the primary topic of concern in this thesis is public housing redevelopment. Little Mountain, BC's first public housing project, a new province-wide approach that involves privatizing public housing sites and rebuilding a mixture of market and social housing on these sites. Mixed income redevelopment of public housing, while relatively new to BC, has taken hold in cities across North America and beyond. In Canada, it started in Toronto with the redevelopment of Don Mount Court, which began with a community consultation process in 2004 that led to the demolition of the housing project later that year. In that case, the first phase of redevelopment, okay, so this is just a map showing you the city of Vancouver, and that's where Little Mountain, that's where it is, like almost right in the middle. Okay, so what was this sensing? In that case, the first phase of the redevelopment has already been completed, and some of the original tenants have moved back. Also in Toronto, Regent Park, which is the oldest public housing project in Canada, is currently being redeveloped into a mixed income community. In that case, redevelopment started with a community consultation process in 2002, which led to relocation of about 1/5 of the tenants in 2005, and demolition of the one section of the housing project in 2006. The Regent Park redevelopment, which will involve six phases of demolition and rebuilding, is expected to take 15 years before completion. Wow. A third public housing project in Toronto, Lawrence Heights, is also in an, I wonder how that one's progressed, is also in an early stage of redevelopment. In the Lawrence Heights case, what appears to be an elaborate community consultation process started in 2008, which ultimately led to Toronto City Council approving the Lawrence Allen Revitalization Plan. In contrast to the way public housing redevelopment has proceeded in Toronto, at Little Mountain in Vancouver, relocation of the tenants and demolition of the buildings has preceded community consultation. Okay, let me read that again. Okay, relocation of the tenants and demolition of the buildings has preceded community consultation. In other words, they relocated the tenants and demolished the buildings before doing the community consultation. The community consultation came after that, which is pretty backwards. At Little Mountain, relocation of the tenants started in March 2007, demolition started in November 2009, and the community consultation process did not really get underway until January 2010 with the formation of the Little Mountain Advisory Group. This timeline of events at Little Mountain would make this redevelopment illegal if it were happening in the United States. Since it was initiated in the United States in 1992, the HOPE 6, okay, so this is a program in the States. HOPE stands for Housing Opportunities for People Everywhere. The HOPE 6 program has involved the redevelopment of hundreds of post-war public housing projects across the U.S., but unlike in Canada, in the U.S., public housing tenants have a legal right to be consulted before public housing is demolished or sold. Although the goals of public housing redevelopment, social integration, and improved physical housing of aging housing stock seem to be benevolent, very often public housing redevelopment in both the U.S. and Canada has involved significant controversy. Critics have pointed out how remarkably similar public housing redevelopment is with the old urban renewal programs of the mid-20th century that gave rise to the very public housing that is now being redeveloped. Similarities between public housing redevelopment generally and the old urban renewal programs include the displacement of low-income families, the tearing apart of social support networks, inadequate community consultation, and the temporary or sometimes permanent reduction in the supply of affordable housing. Right? So this all happened under urban renewal. Okay. Yeah, which gets, that's all fleshed out later on in the thesis, so I'm not going to explain that right now. But public housing redevelopment is being carried out in a very different context than was urban renewal. Urban renewal represented a form of state intervention. Indeed, the rehousing of those displaced by urban renewal in newly constructed public housing projects highlights how urban renewal was connected to the rise of the welfare state. In contrast to urban renewal, public housing redevelopment today is an expression of neoliberal state retrenchment and the erosion of the welfare state. In the US, while most of the financing of redevelopment has been provided by the federal government, such funding has been conditional on public housing authorities' ability to raise private capital. Stricter eligibility requirements for public housing after it has been redeveloped in the US also highlight how public housing redevelopment is connected to the rolling back of the welfare state. Unlike in the US, public housing redevelopment in Canada involves no, or perhaps very little, federal funding. Okay. Right? Because, I mean, there's a big constitutional difference between Canada and the US. In Canada, social welfare is the jurisdiction of the provincial government. In Canada, public housing redevelopment is directly linked to the devolution of responsibility for social housing to lower levels of government and the rolling out of a new set of social arrangements in which the private sector takes an ownership stake in redeveloped sites. At Regent Park in Toronto, the private sector will have a 50% ownership stake, whereas in the Little Mountain case, the site is being privatized outright. After redevelopment, it will probably no longer be correct to refer to Little Mountain as public housing because it is unlikely that the State Housing Authority, BC Housing, will own or even operate the units, right? And that's, technically speaking, in order for something to be deemed public housing, it has to be owned by the government. Before redevelopment, it'd be social housing, but it wouldn't be public housing. Before redevelopment, there were 224 units of public housing at Little Mountain. After redevelopment, after redevelopment, there would be between 1,650 and 3,000 units will be on the site. Of these, only a minimum of 224 will be replacement social housing units. Thus, the vast majority, if not all, of the additional density developed at Little Mountain will be in the form of privately owned market condominiums. The developer will use some of the profits from the market condos to pay for the replacement of social housing units. Redevelopment of Little Mountain will also bring major changes to the physical landscape, as the modernist post-war structures that were there will be replaced with a neighborhood that is designed according to new urbanist and postmodern design principles. The displacement of the tenants, the influx in affluent homeowners, and landscape change are all features of the Little Mountain redevelopment that are consistent with the core elements of gentrification. Right? So, yeah. But unlike classical gentrification, this is a form of gentrification in which the state plays a central role, as is the direct outcome of neoliberal restructuring of the state. So gentrification just means taking kind of a rundown area and gentrifying it. So in upgrading, improving the physical buildings, and then also a higher class of people coming in to live, and a reduction in lower class or working class people. But what it means by classical gentrification, so, I mean, the usage of the word has expanded over time, but its original meaning was gentrification was something that would happen, household by household. People would, basically yuppies would buy these like rundown houses in the ghetto, and through their own blood, sweat, and tears, and their own grit, would upgrade the housing stock by renovating the buildings, the homes themselves, and it would happen house by house. But a trend would set in, and eventually the whole neighborhood is changed. Okay, so that's not exactly what's happening in the Little Mountain case. It's gentrification, but not classical gentrification, because it's not individual homeowners buying up houses. It's the government doing it to a whole area all at once. But this thesis is about much more than public housing redevelopment as an expression of neoliberal restructuring and its unfortunate similarities with urban renewal. In order to understand redevelopment, one needs to know a great deal about what it is that is being redeveloped. As public housing redevelopment scholar Lawrence Vail has remarked, individual places matter, so do the particular residential communities that inhabit them. In the Little Mountain case, one needs to know who was at Little Mountain before redevelopment in order to assess how redevelopment will change the place, either for the better or the worse. Very important point. And there was very little known about Little Mountain before redevelopment, because nobody had ever really written about it or researched it, even though it's very historically significant to, as I've been explaining. There's often a presumption that redevelopment is bound to bring about improved living conditions for the poor. This is because an anti-public housing ideology has reached almost common sense status. According to this ideology, post-war public housing is viewed as a flawed model, irrespective of contextual factors in individual housing projects. For many, it just seems obvious that new urbanist, environmentally sustainable, mixed-income developments offer far superior living environments than the modernistly bland, poorly maintained, socially segregated, and troubled post-war housing projects they replace. Much like the case with urban renewal, this view contains a techno-scientific planning paternalism that seems entirely indifferent to the emotional attachments that poor people in particular develop towards their living environments. Much of the controversy surrounding public housing redevelopment seems to stem from these attachments. At Little Mountain especially, many of the tenants deeply loved the housing project and relied tremendously on their social support networks in place at the housing project. Many Little Mountain tenants also appreciated the sturdy construction of the old buildings and the natural beauty of the large open green spaces at the site. This thesis emphatically rejects the view that all public housing projects are intrinsically socially and physically defective. Such a beautiful sentence. As such, this thesis insists that a thorough understanding of Little Mountain, including why many of the tenants seem to derive so much joy from living there, is absolutely necessary in order to evaluate redevelopment. What Little Mountain was like before redevelopment represents the baseline against which the changes brought about by redevelopment may be compared. Okay, and my thesis is the only study that provides that baseline. But understanding what Little Mountain was like before redevelopment is not a simple task. This is because remarkably little has been written about BC's first public housing project. Unfortunately, the Little Mountain Housing Project was severely under-researched, as urban researchers of Vancouver have tended to focus on the larger public housing projects built in Strathcona, so that's near the downtown east side, under the Urban Renewal Program. This thesis appears to be only the third thesis ever written on BC's first public housing project. The previous two theses on Little Mountain were both written more than a half-century ago in the 1950s. Okay, one of these was concerned with the selection process of the first applicants for the housing project, right? While the other thesis was concerned with the social conditions of Little Mountain shortly after it first opened. I mean, both of them made for fascinating reading for me. After the 1950s, the only other significant research report on Little Mountain is a report from 1982 prepared by architect Byron Olson, who was contracted to consult with the Little Mountain tenants and people in the surrounding community regarding redevelopment and renovation options for the housing project. In addition to these reports, Jill Wade's book on housing in Vancouver during approximately the first half of the 20th century contains several pages detailing the initial development of Little Mountain. Aside from these four rather obscure works, one finds only passing references to Little Mountain in the rest of the literature. In addition, all of these sources that discuss Little Mountain are quite dated. Before this thesis, there was virtually no written record on what Little Mountain was like in the years immediately prior to redevelopment. One of the central goals of this thesis is at least to begin to fill in this significant research gap in order to preserve the memory of this place that has been erased from Vancouver's urban landscape. Right? And that's why my thesis is so important. Stemming from this lack of research, the historical significance of Little Mountain seems lost on many people. The fact is, Little Mountain was enormously important for the development of the welfare state in BC and in Canada. The agreement that was reached in 1950 between the provincial and federal governments concerning the development of Little Mountain essentially spelled out how Canada's federal-provincial public housing partnership program, initiated in 1949, would operate in BC. As the first true example of public housing in BC, Little Mountain paved the way for the public housing projects that followed in this province. This is why the initial development of Little Mountain was so controversial in Vancouver in the early 1950s, with opponents coming close to killing the project several times before it ever got off the ground. Opponents of the very concept of public housing and the welfare state rightly sensed that Little Mountain was only the first such project to come, and at the national level as well, Little Mountain is historically significant. Little Mountain appears to have been only the second public housing project developed under Canada's first federal provincial public housing program, but Little Mountain may in fact be the very first public housing project in Canada that delivered on all the goals of Canada's early housing movement, led by figures such as Clifford Curtis and Leonard March. Since at least the 1930s, Canadian housing movement had been calling for a federal public housing program that paid the majority costs for public housing development and that included all the conveniences of modern life, such as central heating and hot running water. Little Mountain appears to have been the very first public housing project in Canada that delivered on all these goals. Okay, Little Mountain appears to have been the very first public housing project in Canada that delivered on all these goals. Right. So Regent Park is older in Toronto, but Regent Park was not majority paid by the federal government. Okay, and then there's another one that was majority paid by the federal government, but it didn't have hot running water and central heating, I believe. Before it was demolished earlier this year, the Little Mountain Housing Project embodied the Canadian post-war welfare state. Scholars of the redevelopment of Regent Park in Toronto have not had to research independently all the history of Regent Park throughout the time it existed, even going back to the political struggles that led to its initial development. Right. So if somebody's doing a thesis on the redevelopment of Regent Park, they don't need to, like in my case with Little Mountain, they don't need to go explain the whole history of it right from the beginning, because that's already been written about extensively. This is because, as Canada's flagship example of public housing, all this history at Regent Park has been well documented. But Regent Park is an anomalous example of Canadian public housing because it was developed before Canada's federal provincial public housing program, and with over 2,000 units, it has always been Canada's largest public housing project. In many ways, Little Mountain may be far more representative of public housing in Canada, especially in terms of the program under which it was developed, the scale of the site, the number of housing units on the site, and its location outside of the city's downtown core. Right? Those are all qualities of Little Mountain that are more in line with public housing in general in Canada, versus Regent Park, which, the scale is, well, it's huge. Regent Park is huge. Number of units, huge. Location, Regent Park is in this downtown core of Toronto. Okay, but I would not want to take this point too far because Little Mountain had several somewhat unique qualities as well. While compared to Regent Park, the number of public housing units of Little Mountain may have been closer to what is typical for public housing in Canada, Little Mountain was still significantly larger than most Canadian public housing projects. Little Mountain was among the less than 4% of public housing projects in Canada that contain more than 200 units. The very low density and the fact that over 77% of the site was open green space are features of Little Mountain that also seem to be less common in Canadian public housing generally. The absence of crime and other social problems and the presence of a significant minority of middle-class households at Little Mountain also seem anomalous. But it is difficult to be certain just how unusual Little Mountain was in this regard. Little Mountain's apparent uniqueness in this regard may simply result from the tendency that housing projects with the most extreme social problems get the most attention. Right. Although this thesis is primarily concerned with redevelopment, due to the fact that Little Mountain was under research throughout the years it existed, it has been necessary that almost half of this thesis deals with the Little Mountain before redevelopment. This is why death and life metaphors have been used in the title of this thesis and the structuring of its chapters. The death is redevelopment, and the life is Little Mountain before redevelopment, that is before 2007. It's also an allusion to what's her name? I can't think of her name now. Jane. There's a book, The Death and Life of Great American Cities, written by, it'll come to me later on. It's on the tip of my tongue. I can't think of her name right now. That's embarrassing. Oh my God. Okay, the death is... Okay. As this discussion has pointed out, in addition to redressing the lack of research on Little Mountain and demonstrating its historical significance, dedicating significant attention to the life of Little Mountain before redevelopment has been necessary in order to compare the changes redevelopment brings against the baseline conditions of Little Mountain. But another reason that much of this thesis is concerned with the life of Little Mountain before redevelopment is that I think it is very important that Little Mountain be remembered for more than the recent controversies surrounding its redevelopment. Given the lack of research on Little Mountain over the years, many people in Vancouver only first became aware of Little Mountain after reading press coverage of the protests against redevelopment. There is a risk that the life story of Little Mountain may be subsumed under the weight of these recent controversies. I would say it had been. Although it is important to thoroughly understand the deplorable events that have unfolded at Little Mountain as part of its redevelopment, hopefully in order to prevent these tragedies from being repeated elsewhere, it is also crucially important to recognize that Little Mountain was a place with a great deal of history and its own story, quite independent of redevelopment. Little Mountain should be remembered far more for its successful life than its tragic death. The life and death metaphors that structure this thesis also serve somewhat to give agency to the Little Mountain Housing Project as an actant. Yeah. Although Little Mountain was a community made up of people, the place itself was non-human. Known as actor network theory, ascribing agency to non-human actants is an increasingly common collection of approaches that have come out of a rejection of the scientific tradition of treating the object of study as something that is predictable, fully understandable, and as a resource for appropriation of the knower. Although I would not go so far as to characterize this thesis as an example of actor network theory, at various points in this thesis, and especially with the life and death metaphors used throughout, I have attempted to give some agency to the place that was Little Mountain Housing Project. Here it is. Jane Jacobs, that was her name. Finally, the life and death metaphors used in the title and elsewhere in this thesis are an allusion to the landmark book by Jane Jacobs, The Death and Life of Great American Cities. Jane Jacobs was probably the most influential critic of mid-20th century urban renewal who ever existed. Jacobs showed how urban renewal, in its quest to bring new life to American cities, actually destroyed a great deal of what worked in old urban neighborhoods, ironically bringing about the death of these neighborhoods. It is not at all my intention to compare myself to the revered Jane Jacobs. Rather, by borrowing the words death and life from her title, my intention is to underscore the troubling similarities between the old urban renewal programs from the mid-20th century and the redevelopment of the Little Mountain Housing Project. And you know what's really weird is that Jane Jacobs' son, Jane Jacobs was from New York. Her book was about redevelopment of neighborhoods in New York back in the 60s. But her son lives in Vancouver, or right around where the Little Mountain Housing Project was, and was quite active in protesting against the redevelopment. And yeah. But before I discuss the death and life of Little Mountain, it is important to engage with the relevant academic. Okay, and I just want to say before I move on, actor network theory. I would say that was an example of academic trends. Academics, they follow trends, right? They follow trends. They all have to jump on board with the latest cool thing, the latest cool idea. And so at the time I was writing this, actor network theory was all the rage. I don't know if it still is, probably not. So, that's why I was just following in line with that. But before I discuss the death and life of Little Mountain, it is important to engage with the relevant academic literature. In the following chapter, I review more than half a century of social scientific literature on urban poverty and redevelopment. Given the approximately 50-year time frame in the empirical chapters that follow, it is appropriate that the theoretical section of this thesis covers the corresponding time frame. Right? So I'm going over 50 years of academic literature. But this is not to say that my literature review is exhaustive. No, there's always more to read. Chapter 2 focuses on 3 bodies of literature. The first body of literature deals with the mid-20th century urban renewal and its similarities with contemporary public housing redevelopment. Second, I discuss the literature on public housing redevelopment as an expression of neoliberal restructuring. Third, I consider much of the literature on the alleged failings of public housing and how mixed income redevelopment is expected to correct these failings. The literature review is followed by Chapter 3, which discusses both the methods used to research Little Mountain and my own positionality toward this research topic. In this chapter, I discuss my dual role as both a researcher and an activist, and the conflicted feelings this often caused me to experience. It is important to disclose my personal connections to both Little Mountain specifically and some of the more general issues at stake with redevelopment in order to do research that is reflexive about how my own social position relative to my research topic has resulted in only a partial rendering of the Little Mountain story as seen from my particular perspective. My perspective on Little Mountain is simultaneously and paradoxically that of an insider and an outsider. Chapters 4 through 7 present my empirical findings from Little Mountain. The first of these chapters is concerned with the birth of the Little Mountain Housing Project. That is, the political battles that were fought in order to equip Vancouver and BC with its very first public housing project. This chapter makes the case that Little Mountain was historically significant both to BC and Canada. This is followed with Chapter 5, which discusses the life of the Little Mountain Housing Project from 1954 to 2007. This chapter shows how throughout its more than half century of of existence, Little Mountain was a remarkably successful public housing project. Little Mountain avoided conforming to the stereotype of the trouble housing project because it managed to hold on to a significant minority of middle-class households, and it was always rich in social capital, social organization, and social control. Although the Little Mountain tenants themselves deserve most of the credit for Little Mountain's successes, the good physical design of the housing project facilitated these successes. While the first two empirical chapters deal with the Little Mountain before redevelopment, the subsequent two empirical chapters are squarely about redevelopment. Chapter 6 explains how redevelopment has proceeded up to the fall of 2010. This involves discussing the deals reached between the provincial government and the City of Vancouver, and between the provincial government and the developer concerning the redevelopment of Little Mountain, and the backlash that came from many of the Little Mountain tenants and their supporters in the surrounding community. I also discuss how this redevelopment has been tarnished with a serious democracy deficit, as the community consultation process started too late and has effectively excluded most of the Little Mountain tenants. Chapter 6 also shows how the redevelopment and privatization of Little Mountain is part of the neoliberal restructuring of the state and has been enabled by an agreement between the provincial and federal governments that devolves legal title and full responsibility for social housing to the provincial level. Chapter 7 goes on to evaluate redevelopment through a close examination of the distribution of benefits and losses to different relevant groups. The beneficiaries of redevelopment include the homeless, the addicted, and the mentally ill, who will be housed in the supportive housing, a highly targeted and specific form of social housing that is being financed with the proceeds from the privatization of Little Mountain. Thus, I show how the redevelopment of Little Mountain is connected to a broader process of retargeting social housing away from low-income families toward those with addictions and mental illness. In addition, the developer and those who will purchase the market condos eventually built at Little Mountain also stand to benefit from the redevelopment. These actors highlight how the redevelopment of Little Mountain is connected to a broader gentrification process occurring at the neighborhood scale. While in moving condo purchasers, the developer, and even the homeless, the addicted, and the mentally ill all stand to benefit from the redevelopment and privatization of Little Mountain, the Little Mountain tenants have consistently been on the losing end of the deal. This is because for the tenants, redevelopment has involved living in the immediate reality of displacement. Living with the immediate reality of displacement. In the second half of Chapter 7, I explain how BC Housing carried out relocation and how resisting relocation resulted in escalating difficulties for the tenants. I also detail the negative impacts of relocation on the tenants, which I classify into three categories: social, emotional health, and financial material impacts. Chapter 8 concludes this thesis by considering where we go from here. This thesis cannot offer the final word on the Little Mountain redevelopment because redevelopment is not expected to be completed for more than another decade. But I offer several empirical research questions for when the Little Mountain redevelopment is complete. I also consider some of the implications the Little Mountain redevelopment may mean for Vancouver and BC in terms of social housing policy, housing affordability, and social inequality. Finally, I discuss some of the insights the Little Mountain case may be able to offer regarding some of the broader academic debates concerning public housing redevelopment and social mix policies. All right, so that's the intro to my thesis. The next chapter is the literature review. Yeah, that is a very heavy chapter, so that's a lot to go through. So I'm going to eventually do live streams for all the chapters. So I will do that one next on another day. This was a lot went into this thesis. It's the greatest accomplishment of my life. I'm very proud of it, although what happened at Little Mountain was tragic, and has brought me to tears many, many times. I'm sure when we get into the heart of this thesis, I'll be crying again. I can't go through it without crying. It was so tragic. And it's still not rebuilt. Not even close. All right, that's all I have for now. Thank you for watching. Peace out.